At 8:03 a.m. on June 16, 1943, Captain Jay Zeamer Jr. locked his battered B-17E into straight and level flight at 25,000 feet as the dark specks below began to rise. Japanese Zeros, lifting off and clawing upward from the airfield on Buka, just north of Bougainville. Zeamer was only 24, and 3 months earlier this bomber had been written off as bad luck on wings, shot up, stripped for parts, shoved to the edge of the strip like it was waiting to die. He and a hand-picked crew had dragged it back anyway. Nobody else wanted the airplane. Nobody else wanted the jobs they volunteered for. And today, they'd chosen the most dangerous one yet. It wasn't a bombing run. It was a long, unescorted photo recon and mapping mission, roughly 600 miles over open water each way. The kind of task commanders called necessary and crews quietly called suicide. The Pacific had already swallowed dozens of lone bombers over enemy islands, and the odds of making it home without fighters on your wing were brutal. But old 666 carried 9 men that morning, and they'd built a reputation on taking the missions other crews refused. They even had a name for it, the Eager Beavers, because if there was a job nobody wanted, they raised their hands first. They had turned that cursed B-17 into something else. They stripped about 2,000 pounds of unnecessary weight, swapped in fresher engines, and reworked the guns until the ship bristled with extra .50 caliber firepower, so much that to anyone seeing it from outside, it looked less like a bomber and more like a flying porcupine. But none of that changed the basic math. Fighters were faster, higher climbing, and built to kill bombers. And now a pack of them was coming up at roughly 3,000 feet per minute, closing the gap like it was nothing. The problem was the cameras. Mapping work demanded discipline. Hold the line, hold the speed, hold the altitude. No weaving, no violent turns. The photographs had to stay clean. And Zeamer still needed a little more time on this run, minutes that felt like hours, while enemy fighters climbed beneath him over Japanese territory. In the nose, Second Lieutenant Joseph Sarnowski crouched at the bombardier station. He was 28, seasoned by Pacific missions, and he wasn't supposed to be here. His orders to go home were already in motion. His bag was practically packed back at Port Moresby. But this mission needed someone who knew the camera gear and knew what to do when the sky turned hostile. So Sarnowski volunteered anyway. He checked the nose guns, twin 50 seconds, then glanced back toward the cockpit where Zeamer had one more surprise ready. A forward-firing gun he could trigger himself. 16 fighters, maybe more, circling and climbing in the distance against one bomber. The day had started long before sunrise. At 4 a.m., old 666 had lifted from Port Moresby, New Guinea, pushing out over the ocean because the Marines needed photos of Bougainville's western coastline, especially the approaches around Empress Augusta Bay, for a planned operation later that year. But as the mission formed up, a last-minute demand landed on Zeamer's crew. Photograph Buka's airfield first. Reports hinted the Japanese were building strength there. No escort was coming. The P-38s that might have helped couldn't comfortably cover the distance and still fight. And when old 666 arrived early, the light wasn't right yet for the mapping. Too low, too dim, not enough contrast for the kind of terrain detail they needed. They had to choose, loiter over empty ocean and wait for the sun, or start collecting what they could and risk waking the hornet's nest. Below, the fighters reached 24,000 feet, still climbing. Zeamer held the bombers steady while the first attackers broke away and spread wide for a frontal pass, the classic answer to a bomber with a weak nose. Most fortresses did have a weak nose. Old 666 did. Here's the question that always hangs over this story. Can one bomber survive a swarm of fighters over enemy territory alone? If you want to see how old 666 answers that, hit like and subscribe. And then, watch what happens next. The first Zeros tipped over into their dive. Zeamer didn't jink. He didn't twist. He didn't run. The cameras were still rolling, and he needed them to keep rolling. 30 seconds, then 20. Then, the fighter screamed in fast, closing hard. At distance, muzzle flashes flickered. At closer range, the air around the nose turned violent. Sarnowski answered first. His twin .50s barked, and Zeamer added his forward gun, 3 streams of fire converging on the lead Zero. The fighter shuddered, its engine area erupting, and it rolled away, falling out of the attack. But the other 4 kept coming. At close range, cannon shells tore into the front of the bomber. Plexiglass shattered, metal screamed. A blast went off near Sarnowski's position and threw him backward. In the cockpit, impacts punched through the floor and instrument area. Zeamer felt a lightning bolt of pain, his left leg and wrist hit by shrapnel as the attackers flashed past. For a heartbeat, everything balanced on a knife edge. 1 fighter down, 1 bombardier bleeding, 1 pilot wounded, and the rest of the enemy still climbing for another pass, while the bomber was still nearly 600 miles from friendly help. Navigator First Lieutenant Ruby Johnston dragged himself forward, crawling into the wrecked nose. He found Sarnowski collapsed beneath the catwalk, blood pooling on the metal floor. Johnston tried to press a hand over the wound, trying to slow the loss, trying to buy time. Sarnowski pushed him away, not in panic but in stubborn clarity, and pointed back at the guns, because the next wave was already forming. Through the broken nose, Johnston looked up and saw more Zeros dropping in from above, this time smarter. They weren't charging 5 abreast anymore. They came in coordinated layers, trying to bracket the bomber, some from above, some from below, forcing the gunners to split attention and miss angles. Sarnowski hauled himself back into position. His flight suit darkened, his hands trembled, his vision blurred and snapped back. He lined up the lead fighter as it grew in the sight, 600 yards. 5. 4. Then he fired. The twin .50s hammered. Tracers stitched up the Zero's line. The canopy area shattered. Fragments spun away. The fighter rolled and dropped, trailing smoke. Sarnowski shifted to the next one and fired again, punching into the engine. The prop slowed, then stopped. The aircraft fell away, dying in the slipstream. Up front, Zeamer fought the bomber like it wanted to leave him. One rudder pedal was gone, blown apart. Blood filled his boot. The control column felt slick. His wrist burned, fingers half numb, but he kept the ship on the plotted line because the cameras hadn't finished. Those mapping frames mattered. Without them, Marines would go in blind, over reefs and into beaches they couldn't properly read from intelligence photos. Now the attack came from below. In the ball turret, Staff Sergeant Forrest Dillman tracked 4 fighters climbing straight up toward the belly, a place most bombers couldn't defend well. The ball turret was a cramped steel and plexiglass sphere, and Dillman was small enough to live inside it. He'd flown dozens of missions, but he'd never seen this. Fighters trying to spear a bomber from underneath while it was forced to hold a straight line. He opened fire at around 400 yards. The lead Zero tried to pull up and break the aim, but Dillman walked rounds into its underside. A fuel tank ignited, and a bright orange bloom flared in the thin air. The others scattered. At last, the mapping run ended. Zeamer banked left and turned toward the main objective, Bougainville's western coast, while the surviving fighters regrouped above. In the nose, Sarnowski slumped across the guns. Johnston checked for a pulse and found nothing. The bombardier had kept fighting for minutes after a mortal hit, long enough to buy the mission its last frames. Johnston pulled him gently away from the weapons and slid into position, because old 666 still needed every gun it could field. Then another crisis hit. The oxygen gauges fell to 0. Cannon fire had ruptured the system, tanks and lines behind the cockpit destroyed. At 25,000 feet, the crew could only rely on small personal bottles, and those didn't last long. When they ran dry, hypoxia would creep in, confusion, clumsiness, blackout. Zeamer had a choice. Drop now to breathable air, or stay high long enough to finish the coastal run the Marines depended on. He chose time, just a few more minutes, because the cameras still needed to complete the Bougainville mapping. In the cockpit, co-pilot 2nd Lieutenant John Britton came back from a daze. He'd been knocked out by the first blast, blood tracking down the back of his head. He looked at Zeamer and saw the pilot's leg, ruined at the knee, torn and bleeding, and the way Zeamer's face had turned gray from blood loss. Britton reached toward the controls. Zeamer refused with a small shake of the head. Not yet. Hold course. Above them, the remaining Zeros, now fewer but still dangerous, reformed around 27,000 feet. They'd lost aircraft. They'd seen friends take fire in places they didn't expect. And they'd realized the Americans were carrying more guns than any report had warned. So the Japanese leader changed tactics. No more head-on charges into that armed nose. They'd go for the sides, the waist positions, where most Pacific B-17s only had a single gun and a wide, vulnerable fuselage. They didn't know old 666 had twin .50s on both sides. On the right waist, Staff Sergeant George Kendrick braced himself. On the left, Sergeant Herbert Pugh did the same. They watched the count settle. 13 fighters still in the fight. Then the Zeros split. 6 diving in from the right, 7 from the left, trying to overload the gunners and force a miss. Kendrick and Pugh didn't need to talk. They'd flown together long enough to read each other's timing. Kendrick took the right, Pugh owned the left. And if targets crossed, they'd hand them off like practiced teammates. The Zeros dove. Kendrick opened up early, tracking the lead fighter at about 500 yards. His twin guns stitched the wing route. Fuel sprayed and the Zero rolled away, trailing flame. He snapped to the next attacker, missed as it jinked, then corrected his lead and fired again. Rounds tore across the fuselage. The cockpit glass flashed and shattered. The fighter snapped into an uncontrolled roll and fell away. On the left, Pugh let the first Zero come closer, too fast, too committed, then fired when it couldn't dodge out of the stream. The fighter punched through the tracers and pulled up smoking, vanishing above. And finally, the cameras clicked off. Mapping complete. Zeamer shoved the nose down. Altitude unwound. 24,000, 22,000, 20,000. The dive was steep because it had to be. The crew needed air more than they needed height. The Zeros dove with them, hungry to finish it while the bomber was low and slower. At 15,000 feet, Zeamer leveled out. The air was thick enough to breathe. Men who had been seconds from fading out drew deep, desperate breaths. Their personal oxygen bottles were already empty, or close to it. Up top, radio operator Technical Sergeant Johnny Abel climbed back into the top turret. His leg was bleeding from shrapnel, but he ignored it, scanning the crew, checking who was still in the fight. The waist gunners were still firing. The tail was still alive. The ball turret still worked. In the nose, Johnston stayed at Sarnowski's guns, with Sarnowski's body laid beneath the catwalk under a jacket. But the tactical situation had shifted. At 15,000 feet, old 666 was lower and more vulnerable. The Zeros could now dive from above with extra speed. 8 fighters remained fully operational. 8 was plenty. The Japanese leader organized them into 2 4-ship elements, 1 to slash from the rear quarter, 1 to hit from the front quarter. Classic pincer pressure, forcing the bomber to defend 2 directions at the same time. Tail gunner Staff Sergeant William Vaughn saw the rear element first. 4 Zeros in trail coming from 6 o'clock high, the standard approach. Fire, rake the tail, then climb out before the nose could answer. Vaughn elevated his twin .5s to the limit and waited. The Zeros fired too early. Vaughn didn't waste ammunition. He held, then held again, and only when they were committed did he squeeze the triggers. The lead fighter took hits across the engine. Smoke poured out. It tried to pull up, stalled, and dropped away spinning while the others scattered. At the same time, the front element came down on the nose from high left, 10 o'clock, fast and close. Johnston swung Sarnowski's guns, still warm, still loaded, and fired. He missed on the first burst as the Zero knifed in at speed, then corrected his lead and fired again. Hits, cowling, shredded, pieces tearing off into the slipstream. The fighter pulled up trailing smoke, but old 666 shuddered under impact as cannon shells punched through the left wing, and the fight still wasn't over. Hydraulic fluid suddenly misted across the cockpit. Then the number 2 engine began to stumble. First a cough, then an uneven, sickly vibration. Zeamer glanced at the instruments. Oil pressure was falling, cylinder head temperature climbing. The engine was quitting on them. He didn't wait for it to seize. He feathered the prop, pulled it back, and shut it down clean. 3 engines left, and they still had roughly 600 miles of ocean to cross. At 8:45 a.m., the Japanese finally peeled away, about 42 minutes after the first attack. They'd paid for the fight. 4 fighters confirmed down, several more badly damaged. But they were running out of what mattered most. Ammunition was low. Fuel was worse. Their gauges were flirting with empty, and the return to Buka wasn't optional. The enemy leader gave the signal, wings rocking side to side. Then the remaining Zeros turned northeast, climbed, and vanished. Old 666, ragged and bleeding, limped southwest into open sky. Only then did Zeamer sag into his seat. The adrenaline drained like someone pulling a plug, and the pain surged in to replace it. His left leg throbbed with every heartbeat, each pulse sending a white-hot shock through what was left of that knee. His right wrist was still bleeding, a deep cut that exposed tendon. His flight suit was soaked from waist to boots. Blood pooled on the cockpit floor, mixing with hydraulic fluid and the glitter of spent brass. The smell was a brutal cocktail. Metallic copper, cordite, fuel. This time, when Britain reached for the controls, Zeamer didn't fight him. Britain eased the yoke into his hands and held the bomber steady. Zeamer leaned back, eyes half shut, staying awake by stubborn will alone. Behind them, the crew took stock. The damage was unbelievable. 187 bullet holes, 5 20mm cannon strikes. The nose plexiglass was gone entirely. Wind screamed through the open front like a living thing. The oxygen system was wrecked. The radio had been hit early, dead and silent. Hydraulics were bleeding out. Engine number 2 was shut down and feathered. They couldn't call for help, couldn't warn the tower, couldn't request emergency priority. They were alone, and Port Moresby was still about 500 miles away. They had roughly 2 hours of flight time at reduced speed on 3 engines, 2 hours that would decide whether Zeamer lived or bled out over water. Abel and Kendrick crawled forward to work on him. They tore into the first aid kit, found sulfa powder, bandages, gauze, anything that could slow the hemorrhaging. But the wound wasn't something field medicine could fix. Bone was shattered. The bleeding was severe. They packed it tight, wrapped it tighter, and kept pressure with shaking hands. It was the only kind of medicine they had. Zeamer needed a surgeon. Soon. His pulse was thin. His skin had the washed-out color of shock. Lips tinged blue. Johnston stayed forward at the nose station, scanning the sky for a second wave. If fighters were launched from Rabaul, fresh aircraft could be in this region in roughly 90 minutes, and old 666 would be an easy mark. No radio, 1 engine out, wounded crew, compromised systems. But the sky stayed empty, only clouds above and ocean below. At around 9:30 a.m., Britain finally spotted the New Guinea coastline. They'd crossed the Solomon Sea, but the hard part wasn't done. Port Moresby still lay inland, beyond mountains and weather. The damaged bomber couldn't hold altitude. The 3 remaining engines struggled to maintain 15,000 feet, then 12,000, and the needle kept creeping down. Ahead, the Owen Stanley Range rose like a wall, jungle-covered rock, peaks around 7,000 feet. They cleared the first ridges with almost nothing to spare. Zeamer opened his eyes without remembering closing them. The coastline was behind them now. Below, dark jungle. Ahead, mountains. He forced his gaze onto the altimeter, 11,500 feet, dropping. He checked the engine instruments. Number 2 was dead and feathered. Number 1 was running hot, dangerously hot. Cylinder head temperature was edging into the red. Oil pressure fluctuated. That engine wasn't going to last, and if they lost it, they'd be down to 2. 2 engines wouldn't be enough to climb over the range. That meant ditching, either into jungle or wherever they could find flat ground, and nobody trusted a jungle crash to leave survivors. Then the weather closed in. At about 10,000 feet, clouds swallowed them whole. Visibility collapsed to nothing. Britain had no horizon, no mountains in sight, just instruments. Heading, airspeed, altitude, rate of climb. The bomber shuddered through turbulence. Rain hammered the skin of the aircraft. Lightning strobed inside the cloud. Thunder rolled around them like artillery. Old 666 sank through 9,000 feet, blind, with mountains somewhere ahead. Britain held the heading anyway. Trusted the compass, trusted the math, hoped the ridgeline was behind them. At around 9,500 feet, they punched out beneath the cloud and found themselves in a nightmare. Clear air, jagged peaks everywhere, jungle-covered slopes rising on both sides. They were in a valley, boxed in, with higher ground looming close. Britain banked right, following the valley southwest, searching desperately for a pass. The altimeter read around 9,000 feet now, still sliding lower. Number 1 engine was cooking itself, temperature pegged. Britain nursed it, eased power back, coaxed it along, trying to keep it alive without killing it. Then Kendrick came forward with the worst news yet. Zeamer was fading, unconscious, pulse barely there, shallow breathing. Too much blood lost, too much time passed. The bandages were soaked through again. There was nothing left to improvise. Zeamer needed transfusions and surgery. Now, Britain shoved the throttles forward. Caution didn't matter anymore. Speed did. The valley opened ahead, and beyond the next ridge, Port Moresby was close, about 30 minutes if the engines held. Britain aimed for the lowest saddle between peaks and began a climb. The bomber fought upward at roughly 700 feet per minute, well below what a healthy fortress could do. The ridge rushed toward them. Old 666 cleared it by roughly 300 feet. Treetops flashed beneath the belly, and then the valley opened, and Port Moresby appeared ahead, the airstrip, the familiar shape of home. Britain reached for the radio out of habit. Still dead. Nothing. No call to the tower, no warning, no clearance. He had to bring it in raw and hope the runway was clear, and someone on the ground understood what they were seeing. He dropped the landing gear. The hydraulics groaned like a dying animal, but the gear came down and locked. Flaps next, only partial extension. Hydraulic pressure was too low for full travel. The approach would be fast, too fast, but there was no other approach. Old 666 crossed the field boundary at around 140 miles per hour, far hotter than a normal landing. Britain held the nose up, bleeding speed inch by inch. The mains touched, bounced, touched again, then stayed planted. He reversed the props, rode the brakes, and watched the end of the runway race toward him. 2,000 feet. 1,000. 500. Old 666 stopped with roughly 200 feet to spare. Britain shut down the engines. The props windmilled down. And after 8 hours of engine roar, wind howl, and gunfire, the silence that fell into the bomber felt almost painful. Ground crew sprinted toward them. They'd seen the approach, seen the missing nose, the feathered prop, the peppered skin of the aircraft, holes across nearly every surface. They knew it was bad. The crew door opened. Abel climbed out first, then Kendrick, then Pugh, then Vaughn, then Dillman, then Johnston. 6 men moving under their own power, blood-streaked, exhausted, shaken, but alive. A crew chief climbed aboard, took one look at the cockpit floor slick with blood and fluid, saw Zeamer slumped in the pilot seat, then noticed the covered body beneath the catwalk in the nose. He backed out fast and told the medics below, "Get the pilot last. He's dead." They lifted Zeamer onto a stretcher, gray face, blue lips, no obvious movement. Britain climbed down behind them, grabbed the lead medic by the arm and snapped, "He's not dead. Check him." The medic hesitated, then set the stretcher down and felt for a pulse. There it was, weak, thread-like, almost nothing, but present. They ran. Ambulance tires threw dust as they tore toward the field hospital. Doctors didn't dress it up. Zeamer's odds were terrible. 1 chance in 10, maybe less. He'd lost more than half his blood volume, both legs badly shattered, fractures above and below the left knee, wrist tendons damaged, shrapnel wounds scattered across arms and torso, body temperature low, severe shock. They started transfusions immediately. More units, then more, and then surgery, hours of it, working to repair arteries, reconstruct what they could, and simply keep him alive. While he had died at his guns, mortally wounded, bleeding out, he had still dragged himself back into position and kept firing until his heart stopped, holding the nose, holding the mission, buying the crew the minutes they needed. He was supposed to go home in 3 days, back to Pennsylvania, back to Marie, back to family. Instead, he went home as a hero in a casket. He looked at the men who climbed out and asked, "How many fighters hit you?" Britain answered, 16, maybe 17. They came in waves. The crew chief shook his head. That wasn't survivable. Not alone. Then he climbed inside, saw the brass casings rolling across the floor, saw the torn metal, the wrecked instruments, the blood everywhere. And he stopped, shaking his head. He believed it. Within hours, the photographs were developed. Intelligence poured over them. The airfield images confirmed the Japanese buildup, aircraft on the ground, activity that matched the warnings. And the Bougainville coastal mapping frames came out clean. Beaches, reefs, approaches into Empress Augusta Bay. Exactly what planners needed. On November 1st, 1943, months later, the 3rd Marine Division landed at Empress Augusta Bay. Those photos shaped routes, landing zones, and decisions that kept men from walking into reefs and guns blind. The invasion succeeded, and the quiet truth was that a bleeding pilot and a dying bombardier had helped save hundreds, maybe thousands, of lives. Zeamer's price was long and brutal. Months in hospitals, repeated surgeries on the left leg, more work on the right wrist, and a slow crawl through physical therapy. He learned to walk again, but the knee never truly recovered. The limp stayed with him for life. 7 months after the mission, on January 16, 1944, Zeamer received the Medal of Honor at Walter Reed while still recovering, still not fully rebuilt. Sarnowski received his posthumously, his widow Marie accepting it back home. The other crewmen were awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, one of the reasons this flight is remembered as one of the most highly decorated single air missions in U.S. history. 9 men, 2 Medals of Honor, and the rest carrying honors earned in a fight that should have ended over the ocean. Old 666 was repaired and returned to service. It flew more missions, then was eventually retired and scrapped after the war. But the legend didn't retire. Crews said the ship never really looked new again. Patched metal where holes had been, scars where the nose had been shredded, reminders of what happened on the day everyone called impossible. Zeamer survived the war. He built a life after it, education, aerospace work, family, until his death in 2007. He was buried at Arlington, his story tied forever to the number painted on that battered fortress. That's what old 666 became. Not a cursed bomber, but a machine 9 men refused to abandon on the day it had every reason to die. If this story hit you, help it travel. Leave a like, subscribe for more WWII hidden chapters, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. We read them all.